Okay, very good. So let's talk about our two great poles around which biblical morality orbits, and that is the law, which is framed in the negative, and also the life of Jesus, which is framed largely in the positive. In the article that you read, you should have seen, I believe, persuasively, that moral relativism fails. Maybe someone would just like to sort of offer something from the article that you found particularly persuasive. Was there anything that really jumped out to you that you'd like to just offer us here? Okay, go ahead, John.
I underlined one sentence that was very, this idea of tolerance. If everyone ought to be tolerant, then tolerance is an objective moral norm.
Very good. So if we say that tolerance is how we describe or how we define morality, then tolerance becomes the norm. And he even takes it a step further. He basically says that if culture A is tolerant of culture B, the reason behind that tolerance is because maybe you can learn something from that other culture. And so then now you have a second moral standard, which is knowledge and wisdom are good, right? So that sort of grows out of that. And then also the idea, we tolerate other cultures because maybe we could learn from them, which means that now moral growth is possible, and thus moral growth to some other standard become these moral norms. So this idea that there are no moral norms, we should tolerate everything, is itself a moral norm. Tolerance becomes the moral norm, and then there's others that sort of go along with it. Totally agree. Brittany.
I thought it was kind of funny to me, the part that he mentioned about Martin Luther and all of those supposed reformers.
Oh yeah, to me that's the part that really speaks to me. How many of you appreciated that point? The point about how do you have moral reformers if you decide that morality is determined by culture. Basically, you have two options, which is what we've said over here. You can have either cultural or preferential, that is to say individual, personal preference locations for mooring morality. And basically what he says is, let's say that you have culture A that has a set of values. For example, that slavery is okay, that slavery is just. But then you have an individual within culture A, say William Wilberforce, who says slavery is unjust, slavery is wrong. Well, what ends up happening is that here's William. If we say that moral standards are culturally determined, if the culture itself says that slavery is valuable and slavery is moral and slavery is good, then William Wilberforce is now what? He's immoral. He's an immoral person because he's going against the moral standards of his culture. But what Wilberforce is doing is he's holding his culture to a higher standard. What Beckwith says in the article, and it's a great point, is that if we say that morality is rooted only in culture, then the whole notion of moral reformers is definitionally disallowed. You can't have a moral reformer if your standard for morality is what the culture decides. Okay? And so he basically said, by that definition, Moses is immoral, Jesus is immoral, Gandhi is immoral, Martin Luther is immoral, Martin Luther King Jr. is immoral. And to me, that was one of the things. This is sometimes called the argument from moral reformation or moral reformers. Okay? Very good. Anyone else? Something in the thing that you really liked? Yeah, Stefan.
The thing where it said relativism is in itself a closed-minded and intolerant position.
Okay, so relativism is itself closed-minded and intolerant. Very good. I like the little thing that he did there with the little girl that raises her hand. Yeah, that was very good. Very clever. Okay, someone else. Did I see another hand there? Okay, ain't that the truth? Yeah, wasn't that good? Okay, great. So we've talked about can matter be moral. Let's go down there to the question, is Healy right? We were sort of talking about John Healy's statement there. These are outrages against all of us, remember? But of course the question is, who's the us that they're outrages against? Well, obviously they're not outrages against those people that are perpetrating these things. So let's sort of follow this up a little further. Is Healy right? Yes, indeed he is. And his plea tacitly, perhaps unwittingly, assumes, what did I want here? Yeah, oh, that's funny. Yeah, it must be an absolute anchor for morality. I might have thought of something else, but I can't find it there. So the sentence would read, yes, indeed he is, and his plea tacitly and perhaps unwittingly assumes an absolute anchor for morality. Thank you, Joshua, for rescuing me there. But what can qualify as this kind of anchor? Matter and the laws of physics? Hardly. What about personal or community preferences? No, not if we are to take Healy's phrase moral absolutes at face value. One culture's morality, one culture's moral norms are another culture's is immoral in another culture, is what it should be saying. So you could say one culture's immorality is another culture's morality. Okay, if we're going to evaluate that way. Whose culture or personal perspective should we adopt? Hitler's, that is to say power, Hefner's, that is Hugh Hefner, sex, or the Hebrews, which as we've read here, the distillation of the Old Testament is love. So which is it going to be? Hitler, Hefner, or the Hebrews? Whose moral culture should we adopt if it's all culturally relative? And I liked the point that he made there in the article about, remember the woman who was a member of 3 different cultures? She was a member of a church that said adultery was wrong. She was a member, she lived in an upscale liberal neighborhood that said adultery is fine and risque and sort of the way we do things here. But then she was a member of a law firm that was ambiguous or ambivalent toward adultery. So which culture should she be held to? The one that says it's wrong, the one that says it's right and desirable, or the one that is ambivalent about it? Making sense? And I thought that was a very good point, because people are not members of just a single culture. For example, I'm a Christian. I'm also a Seventh-day Adventist. I'm also a male. I'm also a fly fisherman. I'm also an Asscherick. I'm also a... So we all are members of lots of different communities and cultures. We tend to think of culture being only the group of people that you were raised with. So for example, white male, sort of my culture, or American, my culture. But there's lots of different subcultures within a culture, and what do you do when competing subcultures are requiring different moral behaviors? Very good point. It says here, Fyodor Dostoevsky in his Brothers Karamazov famously wrote, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." If God does not exist, everything is permitted. In the novel, it was the middle brother, Ivan Karamazov, speaking, and he was exactly right. If God does not exist, everything is permitted, because how can we expect matter or energy to, number one, have any moral standard, and number two, to have any moral authority to enforce that moral standard? Which is one of the points I really appreciated about the article. You remember he said, what if you had a Scrabble board that all of a sudden sort of Go to Baltimore came up? Remember that? So if Go to Baltimore comes up, do we suddenly move to Baltimore? No, because there's no what? Do you remember? There's no mind. Yeah, there's no one actually saying that. There's no command behind it. It's just chance. And what God has is not only a moral standard, but he has the moral authority to enforce that standard. Okay? I really like that. And so we cannot expect morality to emerge here, but even if a command, a moral absolute, an ought could emerge, where's the moral authority for enforcing it? Who enforces that moral standard? Okay? So you need not only a standard, but you need an agent of enforcement for the standard. Okay? And God qualifies as both. Okay? The next sub-principle says there, or the next sub-point says there, principle or preference. There is a wide difference between principle and preference. A statement of preference might be something like chocolate chip are the best kind of cookies. A statement of principle would be something like killing people without justification is wrong. See the difference? Of course you do, and so does nearly everyone else. But apart from God, all moral perspectives and opinions are simply reflections of personal or community preference. Okay? And the article brought that out brilliantly. Let's say that you have two communities. Let's say that two communities had a moral disagreement over the number of wives one man could have. Community A said that a man could have as many as he could legitimately support. Community B said that a man could have only one wife. Furthermore, let's say that one community is religious, A, and the other is not, B. How could the disagreement be resolved? Is there a standard to which both communities could agree? Perhaps. But if not, they would be at an impasse, wouldn't they? What if a woman from B wanted to become the 10th wife of a man from A? Would that be moral? Well, it would depend on whose standards of morality you judged by, community A or community B's, wouldn't it? For example, most people rightly tend to think of Adolf Hitler as an immoral man. Is that true? We tend to think of him as kind of almost the the distillation of evil. We often think of him that way. Not so many years ago, there was a movie released that was sort of documenting the last few hours of Adolf Hitler's life. I think the movie was called Countdown. Anyway, I don't remember, but it was the last 2 or 3 hours of Adolf Hitler's life, and there were people that protested against the movie, and one of the major protests against the movie was Adolf Hitler comes off looking too much like a person. He comes off looking too much like a real person. You actually find yourself I've not seen the movie, but the reviewer said, you almost find yourself having empathy for him. And the objection is basically, hey, we don't want that guy being anything like us. You know, we want to think of him as a demon. We want to think of him as a monster. And if he comes off looking at all human, we object. But the reality is that he was a human. It's a guarantee that he loved the people that loved him. Isn't that what Jesus said about the Pharisees? Right? If you love those that love you, what do you do more than others? If you greet those that greet you, what do you do more than others? And so we tend to want to think of these kinds of people, the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Idi Amins of the world. We want to think of them as somehow substantively different than us. But biblically speaking, there's not a difference of substance, only a difference of degree. Right? They just have more of what we all have. Or they've acted on it. And so we tend to think of Adolf Hitler as an immoral man. But based on Hitler's chosen moral system, which included the preservation and protection of the white German race, his actions seem to him and to most of the rest of Germany to be decidedly moral. Make sense? Given his standard of morality, was he an immoral man? No, he was a moral man within his own culture. Okay? Within his own culture, whatever that culture might be. So was Hitler moral or immoral? If we judge by his own moral preferences, he was a moral man. If we judge by my moral preferences, he was immoral. Well, whose system should we use to evaluate him? His or mine? Right? Is it moral to hold another community or person to a standard different from their own chosen standard? Welcome to the morass of moral relativism. Okay? And you've had a little bit of exposure to that here. We conclude by saying, fortunately, God's character, God's word, and God's Messiah can deliver us from this boggy, indistinct situation, for God himself is the standard of morality, and say it with me if you would, and God is love. And so our question is, to ought or not? And so we can simply summarize the argument from moral absolutes and moral authority this way. Number one, moral absolutes. Let's read these together. I like it when we do that. Number one, moral absolutes cannot exist apart from a transcendent anchor. Number two, moral absolutes do exist, therefore God exists. 3, matter cannot be expected to be moral, but we do expect people to be moral. Why? Because we know intuitively and self-evidently that man is a moral being in the sense that he possesses moral capacities and understanding. And finally, morality is rooted in God's character of love, revealed in the law and in the life of Jesus Christ. Okay, make sense, everyone? Now, we don't want to miss the question that Dr. Kamazi asked right at the close of our last session, and it's a thorny question, and no one would deny that it's a thorny question. The question is, which standards, some would say there appear to be different standards in the Bible. You have sort of the New Testament, love, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, be ye therefore holy, for I am holy, etc. That's Leviticus 11:45. But then we find God engaging in acts that some of us would say are immoral. Some of us would say these acts appear to be immoral acts, such as the example that Dr. Kamazi gave, and it's a good one, is the issue of what appears to be genocide, right? Where you have, for example, the conquering of the Canaan land, and God said in pretty plain language, often, go in and don't leave anything alive. Sometimes not even beasts, nothing. Man, woman, child, leave none of it alive, destroy all of it, and then take the land. Now, that appears to be, by some standards, immoral. But there's several things that we have to engage with, that we have to understand. First of all, number one, no one denies, least of all me, that this is a thorny issue. We understand that. It's a thorny issue. In other words, there are certain things in Scripture that we just don't understand, things that I don't understand. Having said that, we must understand, number two, that there is a vast difference between me taking your life and God taking your life. I have no moral authority or prerogative to take your life because, number one, God has not granted that to me. And number two, I can't see what God sees. See, God can look down at culture A, culture B, or culture C, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Canaanites, and God can evaluate whether or not those cultures are irrevocably past the threshold of savability. Make sense? So I don't personally have a problem. For me, the thorniness does not reside in God taking back what was always His, life. Making sense? To me, that's not the thorny part. I have no problem with a God who kills, a God who punishes, a God who disciplines, a God who makes alive. To me, that's not even the thorny part. The thorny part that I don't have a full answer to, I have the beginnings of an answer. It's not an answer that I personally find very satisfactory, but it's at least the beginnings of an answer. The thorny part for me is, why did He have the Israelites do it? You tracking with me? To me, if God had just gone in, such as He did with Sodom and Gomorrah, and fire and brimstone comes down and destroys it, to me, God as God has revealed who He is, and He has shown us that He is totally trustworthy. Does that make sense? And so God can look down and He can evaluate the irrevocability or the savability of a given culture. And by the way, this is proved in the discussion that God had with Abraham. Remember where Abraham said, whoa, how are you going to do that, Lord? Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? I mean, what if there were only 50 people? Now, we don't know how many people were in Sodom. We don't know how many were there in Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, but let's just say there were 10,000, okay? So Abraham says, would you preserve it for 50? And what was God's response? Well, what about 45? What was God's response? He said, yeah, what about 40? Yes. He got them all the way down to 10. Okay, so what does this tell us about God? It tells us something very profound, and that is that God would never exterminate those, annihilate those that were savable. Right? These people, according to God, and God's the one who would be qualified in making that determination, are past the point of savability. Okay? So to me, I love that. I don't have an issue with God destroying the earth with a flood, because I think God will save all that are savable. Are you tracking with me? To me, the thorniness is, why does He have the Israelites do it?
What about the babies?
Okay? Yeah, that's where it gets tricky, and you read some of the imprecatory Psalms, and, happy are those that, dash the little ones against the stone. I think it's Psalm 137. I mean, there are some things in there that are tough. The imprecatory Psalms, there are, I think, 4 of them that are commonly cited as imprecatory Psalms. Comes from the term imprecation, which means to curse. To curse. And most scholars believe that what's taking place with the imprecatory Psalms is that under the inspiration of the Spirit, David is lashing out. That's my term. That's not the best term. It's just the only one that my mind is finding right now. He is acting out. He is speaking out against God's enemies. So it's not that David is saying, I'm really mad, so God beat them up because I don't like them. It's under the inspiration of the Spirit. These psalms of imprecation are a reflection of God's own frustration toward evil, etc. But yeah, some of those things are not easily understood. Not at all easily understood. So let me just, I'll come right back to that. So here's the beginnings of the answer that I find only preliminarily satisfying. And I freely admit that I don't have an answer that I'm yet fully happy with. And that is that perhaps God was trying to do with the destruction of the Canaanites the same kind of thing that He was doing in the sanctuary service with the killing of the animals, the sacrifice of the animals, to help the Israelites see the ugliness of sin, to give them a revulsion for sin, and to help them see that the wages of sin is inevitably and invariably death. Now, do I find that answer totally satisfying? No, I don't. But do I think it's maybe the beginning of an answer? Yeah. Just so you know, I've had this discussion with Nathan and with Jeffrey Rosario and with others, and we got to the point where there were a few texts in Scripture that we found so disturbing, Jim, you'll appreciate this, so disturbing is maybe the wrong word, but just so frustratingly difficult to understand. I actually emailed Dr. Roy Gain and Dr. Richard Davidson and said, men, we're very happy. We're on the front lines of evangelism. We're on the front lines of training, and we're very happy with most of our apologetic answers. But there's a few questions that we just really would like to sit down and pick your brains. Can we set up a meeting? And fortunately, They both responded positively. Both Dr. Davidson and Dr. Gain said, absolutely, when can we do it? We tried to set up a time. Unfortunately, we were trying to do it in August. It didn't work out. I wish that meeting would have happened so that I could have come to you and said, we spent 2 days with them, and this is what they said. But that meeting has not yet been able to happen. But I just want you to know that this, to me, is a very good example of things in Scripture that we can say, obviously God has shown himself in the New Testament, right? We have Romans chapter 8, how shall he not with him freely give us all things? He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him freely give us all things? So we see the character of God in the New Testament. So the question is not really the character of God. The question is how do we square what we see here with what we see here? Are you tracking with me? And to me, that's one of those issues that personally I just have to shelf. I have the beginnings of some answers, some things that I do find satisfying. I also have some questions, but like many things in the Christian faith, you just sort of put that on the shelf and you say, as time allows, as revelation allows, as insight allows, as increased wisdom allows, then I'll begin to take some of those issues off of the shelf. But I don't have a satisfactory answer, but I have what, for me at least, is the beginnings of the answer, but I've not yet arrived. Again, I just want to reiterate. I don't have a problem personally. I see no particular problem with God wiping out Ananias and Sapphira or the Canaanites or the Sodomites. To me, that's not really a problem because God has shown that he is totally desirous to save all that are savable. The thorny part for me is why does he have the Israelites do it? And I wish I had an absolutely booming, amazing answer for you, but I just don't yet have that answer.
I can't find this in Scripture, but I've read that kind of troubled my spirit as well. But rumor was there even cannibalism with those people as well? Were they like eating?
Oh, yeah. It's quite possible. Well, we do know that some of them were sacrificing their own children to their gods. For example, Moloch, God, I think it's in the book of Jeremiah, says, you are making your children pass through the fire. And I've done a little bit of reading on that, and apparently there was basically children were given the opportunity to run through kind of a fiery furnace, and if they survived, then they were worthy, and if they didn't, then they weren't, kind of a thing. It was kind of a little terrifying, really. And God even says in the text there, I wish I knew the text right offhand, but he says, man, this never even came to my mind. Yeah, he says, this didn't even come to my mind. So there is a point that you raise there. Basically, if you have a cancer, the doctor wants to get that cancer out as quickly as possible before it grows and becomes metastatic. So if you have here, just as an example, if you have a group of people that say 10,000 strong, okay, and they're reproducing rapidly, and God sees that right now there's 10,000 and they are irrevocably unsavable. Okay, let's just say that God knows that. He has that prerogative. He would be aware of that. Well, in a number of years, right, say a century from then, you may have 25,000 people in that community, okay? So what you've actually done is increased suffering and pain and actually brought about a situation where more people are lost by not truncating the situation here. You follow what I'm saying? So God puts an end to it here because if he doesn't put an end to it here, then it only gets worse here. And now someone says, well, how do we know that God is drawing those lines in the right way? Well, my response is that God has shown us in the New Testament, in the life, death, and Jesus, that he is totally desirable to save every single possible savable person. And beyond that, we just have to trust what we don't know based on what we do know. And the illustration that I use for that is the illustration of marriage. If you marry someone, even if you've known that person for a very long time, the sum total of what you know about that person would be less than 2% of what there is to know about them. Okay? So you get married to someone, even if you've dated for 2 or 3 years, there's so much that you don't know. Okay? Like, do you know what the name of their 3rd grade teacher was? Do you know this? Do you know that? You can just go right down the list. Even being very generous, let's say that you knew after 2 years 5% of everything there was to know about that person. It would seem a little irrational to marry someone that you know so little about. But the reality is that I've been married to my wife now for 10 years and still discover new things about her all the time, things that I didn't know. So what you do is you trust what you don't see based on consistency in what you do see. Does that make sense? And we treat God that way. There are things that we just don't understand and know. But the things that are revealed are for us and our children, and the things that are not revealed are for God. And based on what we do see, we trust with what we don't see and understand. So I like the marriage illustration. Katie.
Jim's question.
That society was a theocratic society in which God was giving direct revelation of himself. Subsequent societies today, for example, someone who might say, well, God told me to do ABC. We no longer exist under a theocracy. God is not traveling with the children of Israel in the tent. You don't see the pillar of cloud by day. You don't see the pillar of fire by night. And so there was a direct revelation there that God had given that is not available to us today. And I think that's persuasive, by the way, because we don't see that same... When the theocracy ends, when the God government ends, we understand by theocracy, right? We don't see Jesus carrying out that same kind of mandate in the New Testament, right? For example, when it comes time to remove Ananias and Sapphira from church membership, so to speak, who does it? Yeah, God does it. So I think that we do see a transition there, and my hunch is that transition began in the time when Israel elected to have Saul as their king, and shortly thereafter you have Solomon, you have David, and then Canaan is conquered, and you don't see that same kind of, for lack of a better term, genocide. I think it's a transition out. I think it's progressive. So, yeah, that would be my response. It's maybe not a perfectly satisfying response, but I think it's at least headed in the right direction. Yeah, Mike.
Here's a question. It's pretty much...
Everybody has a chance to know, everyone has adequate chance to be saved, not just based on direct revelation, i.e. Noah or Scripture, but what you're asking, the question you're asking is a variation, for example, of any modern situation. Does somebody have the opportunity to be saved even if they don't have access to the Bible or to Seventh-day Adventism or to an actual missionary? And we believe that God reveals himself to every man. Jesus Christ is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And also the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, etc. So yeah, I think the answer is it's possible that it did, but it's not necessary that it did, because those deaths were still just because everyone had at some level an opportunity. Make sense? Everyone had at some opportunity. By the way, let me just say something on this, and then we may have to press on. There's a little bit of a misunderstanding about what God is obligated to do. God is not obligated to give everyone an exhaustive opportunity to accept him. God is not obligated to give everyone an exhaustive opportunity to accept them. In order to abide by the principles and standards of the great controversy, apparently what God has to do, and it makes sense to me, is give everyone an adequate opportunity to accept him.
But we're given pretty much an exhaustive opportunity.
Yeah.
That's fair to the rest of humanity.
No, I think very, very, very few people get an exhaustive opportunity. Because the person that died at 75, what if they lived to be 78? The person that died at 78, what if they lived to be 82? So I think very few people get an exhaustive opportunity. The only ones that I would say get an exhaustive opportunity, so to speak, are those that commit the unpardonable sin. Those that are totally unsavable no matter what would have happened. You tracking with me? And so what does God do for the rest of humanity? He gives everyone adequate, I would say more than adequate opportunity to be saved. In other words, repeated options. But at some point, God has met the requirement of justice, beyond which he doesn't have to give everyone a totally exhaustive. For example, remember what Jesus said. Jesus said, "Woe unto you, Chorazin! Woe unto you, Bethsaida! Woe unto you, Jerusalem! For if the works that were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have remained to this day. And if the works that were done in you would have been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes." So what's he saying? What he's saying is you're getting more opportunities than they got. But they're just, here, it's very simple. Was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Tyre and Sidon just? Absolutely just. So the fact that God is giving these people more of a chance doesn't make that unjust. Remember the laborers? He comes out, and these people work all day, these people work half the day, these people work 1 hour in the day, and what does the employer do? He gives everyone the same, and then people complain and say, hey, that's not fair. And what does he say? He says, wait a minute. How is it not fair to you that I'm being very kind to them? Right? What he actually says is your eye evil because I'm good? Right? So as long as he's paying them a fair wage, that's fair. It's just that these people are getting grace and these people are getting still more grace. But no one is being treated unjustly. Okay? We have our concepts of justice are a little warped. We have an almost communist view of justice, that everyone must have identical opportunities. The reality is that everyone's opportunity to accept or receive Jesus as their personal Savior is absolutely mitigated by your own choices and by a host of things. Your own free will is mitigated by a host of things. For example, the genetics that you get from your parents, the wealth or lack thereof of the family that you're born into, the kind of father that you have, the kind of mother that you have. In other words, to think that everyone's getting identical opportunities and identical chances is a little bit naive and idealistic. Everyone is getting sufficient and adequate chances to be saved.
Doesn't that make for arbitrary justice?
No, not at all. As long as every single person has adequate or more than adequate opportunity to be saved and to come to truth, that's just. Absolutely just.
Can I relate that to our outreach? Are you saying a 15-minute conversation at someone's doorstep is enough for them to come to that conclusion?
Yeah. Nadia's asking a good question. What if you just have someone, a 15-minute question, a 15-minute conversation with someone at outreach? Is that sufficient? The answer is it may be. But remember that 15-minute conversation that you have with someone at outreach is only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. God is working on every person continually. Maybe you've read the poem The Hound of Heaven by, I think, Francis Thompson. Marvelous poem. And basically it's this idea that the Spirit is this hound of heaven, chasing, always pursuing, always after, always wooing. And God woos us through so many things. He woos us through the internal sense of morality that each of us have. He woos us through the beauty of nature. He woos us through the tenderness and beauty of human relationships. He woos us through so many things that no one will be unjustly condemned.
At what point does God stop chasing a person if they're hard?
Oh, that's a great question. God never stops. God never stops. I don't believe that God ever stops. If anyone in the final analysis, when people in the final analysis are lost, it's not because God's pursual or the person's internal barometer moral barometer couldn't have worked. It's because they have so hardened their hearts and so sealed themselves off from God that there's nothing that God can do. That's the unpardonable sin. I don't ever see God ceasing. The God that is presented to me in Scripture is never a God that is ceasing to pursue its people who are saying, leave me alone. In fact, what do we find right there in Genesis chapter 3? God pursuing Adam. If God would have been unjust, he would have just let Adam fend for himself. Okay? So I just want to repeat, to meet the standards of justice, and by the way, who's going to hold God to a higher standard? I mean, I assure you that God's standard of justice is much higher than yours. So if God is sufficiently satisfied, all of us should be as well. God does not have to provide absolutely exhaustive opportunity for everyone to be saved, but he certainly does and will provide sufficient opportunity for all to be saved. Incidentally, how many of us have read the statement there, or the little section there in the book Early Writings where Ellen White talks about slaves?
Yes.
Have we read that? I remember the first time I read that, I thought, man, what a risky thing to say. And she basically says that there will be some slaves who knew nothing but their master's whip, and they were treated like brute beasts, they were treated like common animals, and they never even had a chance to even begin to make steps, the right kinds of moral steps that a human being under other circumstances might be able to make. And do you know what she says about them? About in the resurrection? She says that a merciful God does the best thing that he can do in that circumstance. And she says they do not come up in the resurrection, either the first or the second resurrection. She's not talking about all slaves, of course. She's talking about a certain class of slaves that were treated like common beasts. And she says that they will come up in neither the first or the second resurrection. She says God permits them to be as though they had not been.
So just had a life of misery.
Yeah. Well, the thing you have to understand...
How just is that? Seriously.
Well, my response to that is that there's two things that qualify us for heaven. A title for heaven and a fitness for heaven. Right? A title for heaven and a fitness for heaven. And if someone lacks the fitness for heaven, how can God bring them to a place that he may know would be torturous to them anyway?
A vision.
Yeah, it's possible. I think what she's saying is actually I think it's very morally insightful, and I think it's very powerful. I think it shows the predicament that God is in. In other words, we sometimes think that God can just save whoever he wants, kind of almost willy-nilly, but I think that it really shows the predicament that God is in, that the savable are those who want to be saved and who are able to be saved. Now, I think, let me be open with you here, Mike, I think that is a very small group of people, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that God is going to do, I guess I take comfort in the fact that God is evaluating every single circumstance based on its own merit. He is doing the very best thing he can do in this case. He is doing the very best thing he can do in this case. He is doing the very best thing that he can in this case. And beyond that,
The angels will complete this mission of evangelism.
yeah, totally.
Where we don't. So certainly there are people out there that were slaves that could have gotten a message from an angel.
Exactly.
I'm not uncomfortable with her using that statement and with us believing potentially that that's the character of God reflected through her words. It's a very indicting statement.
Well, we just disagree, I guess. From where I'm standing, there are going to be lots of people. Let me ask you this question. Every single person that is lost, are they necessarily lost? Or had their life been permitted, could they have been saved? By what you're saying, you would almost have to insist that every person that is lost could not have been saved. That if their life had continued, they would have necessarily be lost, which seems to bring about the, I think, unbiblical notion that everyone that's lost commits the unpardonable sin. Let me put it to you this way. Just because someone dies at the age of 17 does not mean, oh, God knew that person wouldn't be saved and therefore he allowed them to die prematurely. It's quite possible that had that person lived to be 35, they may have been saved. Are you tracking with me? And someone says, well, how can that be? Well, welcome to the great controversy. Welcome to a war in which there are genuine casualties, not just artificial casualties. So to me, the other view, and I'm not saying you advocate this view, but to me it seems to imply that view. To me, the other view just looks like Calvinism. It looks like predestination. God has determined who's in and he's determined who's out.
I mean, we have the Canaanites, they had children that were not of age and reasoning based on Jewish standards. Okay?
Yeah.
So are they condemned to hell because their parents were Canaanites?
Now that we don't know. We just don't know. We have no idea.
Places in here where there's wiggle room.
Yeah, I agree.
Where God would have to look at that and say, as he says, I don't hold people to the same standard who don't know.
Oh, totally.
Who that do.
I completely agree with that.
That may be that maybe she misspoke. Was this a vision that she was given of that?
Yeah. I'll show it to you in the break. I'll show you the context. To me, actually, in the larger context of the early writing statement, to me, it's really quite. I'll show it to you, and we can sort of have that conversation. But as far as the children of the Canaanites go, God can do there whatever it's best for God to do, and whatever that is, we're going to, at the end of the millennium, which is, by the way, why we need 1,000 years. These very kinds of questions are exactly what we're going to be going over for 1,000 years. And at every point, what do we say? What does it say that the saved say? Just and true are thy ways, O King of saints, and just and true are thy judgments. So we're going to affirm. But in the meantime, the things that are revealed are for us and our children, and the things that are not revealed are for God. Ellen White even says, speaking about the issue of children, she actually says that when it comes to this topic, what is unrevealed, what is not yet revealed, she says the best course of action is silence. She says silence is eloquence. Now, I don't think she says don't talk about it. What she's saying is don't make any prognostications about it. It's going to be this way. She says at this point we just have to kind of throw our arms up and say, we'll see when we get there. But I will say this, in that very same book, Early Writings, she shows in vision little ones. You might remember, she basically says that there were a group of the saints who were walking to a particular mountain, and she says that some elected to climb the mountain and others elected to fly to the top of the mountain. She says there were just little children. And so, obviously, children are going to be there. So, in the inimitable words of Nathan Renner, it'll all come out in the wash. But exactly how it's going to come out, we just don't know. Okay, a couple questions, and then we're going to advance because we're just running out of time. We'll take you, Rusty.
I think this is a really good example of ought, because we're sitting here saying what God ought to do. In our limited...
And I think Mike's question is a great one, because what's happened is that evil agents evil agents have basically truncated someone else's potential to know what's true. And let me put it to you this way, Mike. Here's what I would say. We don't often think of it this way, but I think the greatest victim in the great controversy we'll find is God. I think that our victimization in the great controversy is a fraction of what God's has been. And
He's being judged now.
oh, there's no question. There are things that God would love to be able to do, but cannot do. And we'll talk about that. I'm dealing with some of these very issues in my book on the great controversy that is forthcoming. But I just want, we're children groping in the dark. We see.
The prophet wouldn't have written that, though, seriously. Like,
Yeah.
actually makes me mad. Like,
Well, I would say read it in its context. Don't take my paraphrase of it. Read it in its context, and then sort of evaluate it based on that.
Besides the slaves as well.
No, the issue that she raises, no, that's a little different circumstance. The issue that she's raising with the slaves in the early writing statement, these were probably young children who were basically taken from their parents. They were put in slave ships. More than half of the slaves that were put on. If you've not seen the movie Amazing Grace, do yourself a favor and watch it. Amazing Grace, it's the story of William Wilberforce, very disturbing and very thrilling at the same time. How many of us have seen it? Okay, well worth seeing, basically, more than half of those slaves that were on those ships died. I mean, it was terrible. So she's talking about those kinds of people who came, and the moment they get off the ship, they're brutalized, they're never taught to read, they're not treated as human beings, they're treated as common brute beasts, they're treated like cattle. And so the issue is that she says, I remember part of the exact language is she says, they knew nothing but their master's whip. And so the Jews would be in a much different category there. The Jews in the Holocaust, they would have been illiterate people, they would have been an aware people. Of course, there were children that were involved as well, but two different groups.
And my other question is, being God, can he change his mind about them sending to heaven?
Oh, that's a good question. Can God change his mind? I personally believe so. Yeah, I think so. I think he frequently does, actually. And I'll actually address that in. Are you coming to the GYC?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll see you there.